Well, good morning. Welcome to our Sunday morning Bible study. We're continuing our discussion of how do we know that the Bible is from God, or how do we know it's trustworthy. I have been invited by the government on 2 or 3 occasions to serve on juries. And in every case, the judge would give us instructions about making our deliberations. And not one time did he ever say, you people just do what you think is best. In every case, he said, you must make your decision based on the law, and he would explain the law in this particular case, and on the evidence. And he would make it very clear, and they would go on and on and on about this. You must make your decision based on the law and on the evidence. Not on emotion, not on your feelings, not on whether you like the person or not. That's irrelevant. It's on the law and on the evidence. One of the saddest verses in the Bible we find in the book of Judges. The last verse says, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And this was the most chaotic time in Israel's history. It was a disaster. There was horrible things going on in the nation. And they turned away from God over and over. The whole book of Judges is a series of rebellions of the people against the rule of God. And then God would send punishment, and then they would pray for deliverance, and God would send a judge to deliver them. But it all happened because there was no respect for the laws of God. Everyone did as he saw fit. Today, we have a just as big a problem. What is right? What is truth? What is the truth of everything? How would you feel if you went to your doctor and your doctor examined you and says, well, I have no clue what's wrong with you. I'm just going to give you 12 prescriptions and you take them all. Actually, my niece, for the last many months, has been suffering terribly. She has lost from about 160 pounds down to 109 pounds, and we've really been worried about her life. We thought she might not make it. I mean, she was so sick, and the doctors had no clue what was wrong with her. And then about a week ago, they decided, oh, maybe she's got celiac disease. They'd been treating her for everything else. But celiac disease is because your body cannot handle gluten, which is a major ingredient in flour and many of the foods that we eat. But if you can't handle it, then it's very destructive to your system. We're hoping that's what it is, because if that's it, that is very treatable. But the truth is vital. You have to know what's right. You know, if you decided to build a house and you showed up on the building site and you went up to the contractor and said, well, what's this going to be like? And the contractor says, well, we don't have any blueprints. We're just going to start building and see what happens. That wouldn't work either. You've got to know how big this thing is going to be. You've got to know what materials you're going to use. In every area of life, there's got to be a standard of truth. There's got to be right and wrong. There's got to be a measure of things. And how important is it that we have a measure for right and wrong, for spiritual matters? Well, either God has given us a standard of truth, or we're left to our own devices. And so Christians believe that the Bible is the standard of truth. The Bible makes an extraordinary claim for itself. All Scripture is God-breathed. It's all from God. And it all has to be accurate. Once you start saying there are errors in the Bible, then where do you go from there? If you ever say that there are errors in the Bible, then you've got nothing, because you don't know what's right. And so I think people of faith must accept that God went to great lengths to make sure that what we have is accurate, that the Word of God is trustworthy. Now, the reason we have so much chaos in the religious realms today, so many churches, so many different belief systems, is because the Bible is no longer considered the standard by most people. Last week we talked about that surveys show that only 1 out of every 4 professing Christians, now that's people who claim to be Christians in America, only 1 out of 4 of them believe that the Bible is the accurate, inerrant Word of God. And if only 1 out of 4 Christians believes that, can you imagine where that leaves the world? And if there is no standard of right and wrong, then what do we go by? And I think that's one of the reasons our country is in such a mess right now, is there is no standard of right and wrong. Whatever you choose to believe is right. The predominant philosophy of America right now is this idea that you get to choose what's right for you. You get to decide what you want to believe. Well, that won't work in any other area. You know, when you go to school, you don't get to decide what to believe about math. You don't get to make that determination and say, well, I don't like the idea that 2 + 2 is 4. I want it to be 7. Well, that just won't work at all. You won't pass. In any area of life, you've got to have standards of truth. What's right? What's wrong? What is inaccurate? How much more important is it that we have a standard of truth for spiritual matters? Because that's eternal. That is eternal. If we believe that we're going to be alive after death, then we've got to know what's right. How do we get to that point? So I'm looking at some things. Last week we started looking at some evidences from the Bible that it is a supernatural book. It's not just something that men wrote. And last week we looked at several proofs that the Bible is accurately, it reveals things that the Bible could not know, that humans could not know without God revealing it to them. And we showed a number of things about how God dealt with disease and how God revealed things to the Israelites that they could not possibly have known. Some medical issues that humans did not discover until actually in the 1800s. So for 3,000 or 4,000 years, men did not discover these things, such as bacteria and certain elements of disease. But God revealed to the Jews. And of all the nations on the earth, the Jews have had the fewest problems with certain diseases of any nation in history. And why? Because they followed God-given directions on how to deal with certain diseases. And so they have been troubled by less of these than any other nation because they followed God's pattern. But the only way they could have known these was by being given by God, because they certainly didn't get them from the Egyptians. We looked at how the Egyptians treated medicine. When we finished last week, we were looking at some of the diet restrictions that God gave the Israelites. And again, these were not known until very recently in medical science. We've talked about in Daniel, the boys ate the vegetables, and we now know that a vegetable diet has many benefits, and eating certain other kinds of meat would be harmful, particularly back in olden days before they had the ability to kill some of the parasites that were in meat. We talked about the eating of fat and blood, which we now know is a bad thing. God forbid Israel from eating those things because he knew they were not good for the people. And we were taught, well, this is where we were when we finished last week. These are interesting to me. The Bible plainly says that there are certain animals that the Jews could eat, certain animals that were considered clean. And we now know that the reason God gave these particular animals that they were to be eaten was because they were less liable to transmit disease to humans. The qualifications for a four-footed animal, for example, were they must have a split hoof and chew the cud. And we were talking last week about the cows and the deer, any member of the deer family, goats and sheep and so forth. And these animals are far less likely to transmit diseases than other animals, such as rabbits or pigs. The reason pigs were considered unclean is because they carry certain diseases, particularly trichinosis. Nowadays, we know how to prepare pork so it's not dangerous, but in ancient times, they didn't know that. Rabbits can't be eaten because they don't have a split hoof. They do chew the cud, but they don't have a split hoof. And they carry tularemia, rabbit fever, and so forth. God also gave instructions about what kind of fish could be eaten. A fish to be eaten had to have fins and scales. Now, we now know the dangers of eating shellfish. Many people in our culture, and I know several, that cannot eat shellfish at all. It's very deadly to them. And so God says, eat certain fish, they're safe. Insects. The Bible says that the insects that can be eaten have to have a jointed leg and hop. Well, that sounds funny, but that would be members of the crickets, locusts, grasshoppers, and so forth. They had no clue for thousands of years why those are the only insects that could be eaten. We now know they carry fewer diseases than other kinds of insects. And then birds. God forbade the Jews from eating birds that ate meat, either carrion eaters or would eat fresh meat. Again, a bird that would eat meat is far more likely to carry a disease than birds that only eat vegetables. And so God was specific about which birds they could eat. So it's interesting that we see all these dietary rules that God gave to Israel in the law of Moses. And the Jews didn't understand why these laws were there. But God knew what he was doing. And we've only found out recently why these animals are edible. And so God had to reveal this because this was completely unknown for thousands of years. And so we see once again God's system works. And God had to reveal these things out of time because medical science had no clue. Medical science didn't even know there were microscopic organisms until the last 150 years. And so for all that time before, God prevented microscopic organisms from attacking them by giving them these rules, which no one else could possibly know. They had to be divinely revealed. Now, we have to be careful. The church has been guilty of some questionable science in the Bible. I've run across a few of these. We'll hit these very rapidly. Job 38:7. Some have said, oh, that's talking about radio astronomy. No, it's a poetical way of saying the angels sing is all it's saying. We won't take. Job 38:22 talks about treasures in the snow. The King James Version words it that way. And some well-meaning brethren have said, that proves that snow has nitrogen in it. Well, I think that's a reach. Another translation of this, more modern translations, talk about that God brings the snow out of his storehouses. I think it's a more accurate way of looking at it. But again, it's not trying to make some scientific revelation. The Bible is not meant to be a book of science. It's a book of truth. And sometimes it touches on scientific matters, but we must be careful not to try to rip it out of its context. In Joshua 10, this is probably the best known example of all these. We have the example of where God turns the sun back and allows the sun to stand still so that they could finish the battle. And it made almost all the church bulletins around the country. I mean, I saw them back when I was a kid, and I'm sure you've seen these on the front page of the bulletin that NASA says that there was a lost day in the computer. That never happened. That never happened. That was just something that somebody thought would be a great idea, and they printed it, and it just went viral. But that, as far as we know, that actually never happened. NASA never did find that in their computers. That missing day we have to take on faith. That has never been confirmed by science. So let's be careful not to abuse Scripture trying to prove something the Bible never meant to say. And then Psalms 8 talks about the paths in the sea. And some of my well-meaning brethren say, that proves that there are ocean currents that God revealed. Well, it may or it may not. Again, that could be a poetical thing. We have to be careful trying to use things the Bible does not actually pretend or intend to teach. And then Isaiah 40:22 says, God sits above the circle of the earth. And guess what people said that meant? That the earth is round. A lot of my brethren says, that proves that God revealed that the earth is round. Well, actually, that's just a Jewish way of saying the whole enchilada. God sits above the circle, meaning everything. Again, we can try to make too much out of some of these sayings. I don't think God was trying to say that proves the earth is round. That was not the intent of the passage. The passage was basically saying God sits over all of it. It's just a way of saying things. Genesis 15:5, God's talking to Abraham, and he says, well, if you can count the stars, which obviously you can't. And some of my brethren says, well, that proves that there's lots of stars. Well, maybe so, but I'm not sure that's a scientific statement as much as just an observational statement. If you ever tried counting the stars, you realize that's a tough chore. Job 8:16 talks about the green plants, and somebody says, that proves photosynthesis. Well, I've read the passage in several versions, and I just don't see photosynthesis being taught there. Again, that may be a reach. Now, the traditional views of the earth throughout history, in ancient times, the Greeks taught that the earth was upheld by Atlas on his shoulders. And that was a common view of the Greeks for many years. Another common view of the earth was that it was flat and it was held up by elephants standing on the back of a turtle. I mean, there's some creative ideas here. It's amazing how the mind of ancients came up with things. Now, obviously, by observation, what's the shape of the earth? By observation, if you just go outside and look, what's the shape of the earth? It's flat. It's flat. And so for most of history, the world believed the earth was flat. And again, you have several different cultures with their ideas of how the earth existed, and that the earth, a very popular one was the earth is standing on the back of elephants. I don't know where they got that idea. Or the back again on the turtle. But the earth was usually considered flat up until actually the Middle Ages in this world, in our culture. It was believed by most that if you sail far enough out, what would happen? You just fall off the edge, yeah. So you got several of these views in history, fairly recent history, that the earth existed on the back of some creatures, or that the earth was flat. And it was commonly believed up until the last few hundred years that if you sailed far enough out in the ocean, you'd just sail off the edge of the world. This was very common in its beliefs. It was a very brave sailor that would sail out of sight of land. Now, some of the great astronomers, actually, of history, Galileo, Copernicus, and so forth, these men began to question the flat earth idea, that actually the earth was round. Early on, people began to say, when they would watch the ships sail out of harbor, what would they notice? That as they got on the horizon, what would happen? That it would get shorter. And so they began to think, well, maybe it's not flat after all. And they began to see that there might be a curvature to the ocean. And then once the astronomers came up with lenses and began to do measurements of the shadows on the moon and so forth, they began to figure out that, well, maybe it's not flat. Maybe the earth is round. Now, when that idea was first brought up, it caused a lot of consternation. Job says he spreads out the northern skies over empty space. He suspends the earth over nothing. Now, a lot of people said, that proves that the earth is not flat and that the stars, there's this empty space. A lot of Christians said, that proves that God is revealing something to us. But actually, there are stars there. We just can't see them. So God wasn't trying to make a scientific statement in these cases. A lot of these things are just observations by humans who wrote them down. They were meant to be poetical. They weren't meant to be accurately scientific. So the Bible doesn't pretend to reveal all this esoteric science to us. It's basically talking about the glory of God and how He is incredible. Now, this is something that is much more concrete. We all know the story of Noah and the flood. And we all know that God instructed Noah to build this gigantic ark and put the animals on it. And there have been a lot of critics about, this couldn't possibly have happened, all these things couldn't possibly have happened. And so they recently built a full-scale model of the ark according to the biblical standards. I've heard it's a very fascinating study. This is roughly what the ark would have looked like according to the Bible directions. It was basically built for one purpose, and what's that? To survive, to be stable during a flood. Now, if the water rose 20 or 30 feet above the highest mountains, you would naturally have some pretty good waves. So you would need to build this thing to survive high water, high waves. Obviously, the water was not just going to be flat and calm all the time. Now, if you don't need to build a boat to go anywhere, you only need to build it to survive. And a lot of the Bible critics complain, no, that's not working. But what they did, and this has just fascinated me to death. Now, this was written 1,400 years ago. We know that for a fact. The Dead Sea Scrolls have now proven that the Bible is as old as it claims to be. We know that the Old Testament was written by Moses 1,400 years before Christ. So that's Genesis 5 gives us the directions for how to build the ark. It's to be 450 feet long. How long's a football field? About a little over 300 feet. So we're talking about a boat that's 1.5 football fields, 75 feet wide. And I think a football field is 75 feet wide, isn't it? Isn't that about right? And 45 feet high. So that's 3 stories. Now, the Scripps Institute of Oceanography from La Jolla, California. This is a very prestigious scientific organization. They got the bright idea to build a scale model of the ark. They use the same dimensions the Bible uses. And they put it in a wave tank. They designed a wave tank to test their model. And they wanted to see how God's directions would work in a wave model. And so here's the wave tank that they built to test the ark of Noah, Noah's Ark. And what they found was amazing. They found that of all the dimensions that you could have built the ark, guess which the most ideal dimensions were to survive high waves? The exact dimensions that God gave. They found that a boat built to the dimensions that the Bible gives, this model survived waves equivalent to 75 feet high. That's a pretty good wave. And they found, and their analysis was, that if you were building a boat just to survive, the most ideal dimensions would be the ones given in the Bible. Again, how would Noah have known that? He wouldn't. God had to reveal that to him. But it does show that God knew what he was doing and that God gave Noah. Now, what was Noah's background as far as building boats was concerned? Evidently, he had absolutely none. And so he had to get these directions from somewhere. Well, we believe God gave them to him, and science bears out that at least the theory is sound, that this is the way it would have done. God gave Noah the most ideal dimensions. They tried various other models. They tried other longer boats, wider, narrower. But this is the most stable shape you could possibly build a boat to survive. Now, again, if you're going to go somewhere in it, this isn't the best design. But if you just want to survive high waves, this is the most ideal model. I think it's fascinating. All of our lives, we have heard of the Big Bang. What's the Big Bang? That's how it all started. Science for hundreds of years, or 100 years maybe, has been teaching. I remember when I was in grade school, I was taught the Big Bang. That at one time, billions of years ago, all the matter in the universe was in one ball. And then there was the Big Bang where that exploded and all the matter in the universe went flying through the universe, creating all the stars and the planets and the asteroids and everything. And that's where it all started. And for decades, this was the model. Every university taught it, every science textbook taught it. The Big Bang was how the universe came to be. And that was accepted as truth. But unfortunately for the proponents of the Big Bang theory, in the last couple of decades, physicists have started to question the Big Bang theory. And they began to realize that the math just does not work. I Googled it last night. You might want to try this sometime. I Googled it. The problem with the Big Bang theory. And they have come up with a whole host of reasons why the Big Bang could not have possibly happened. It's just full of holes. The theory just doesn't work for so many reasons. And so many of the physicists are trying to scramble to come up with another theory, but they don't have one is the problem. Where did the universe start? How did it get here? Now, if you want to accept evolution, that's one thing. But to accept evolution, what do you have to have first? Sir? Yeah, where did it all come from? Where did the stars and the planets come from? And at this point, physics does not have an answer to that. If you deny God, if you deny creation, you've got nothing. There is absolutely no rational theory out there right now. Now, they're looking for it desperately and they believe they're going to find something. But the Big Bang theory has been basically debunked. I mean, it just doesn't hold water. There are so many problems with it. I was reading one thing last night that said the time element alone just doesn't work. For the Big Bang theory to be accurate, it would require so many billion years. But the math just doesn't work at all. It can't possibly be as old as they're saying it is. So, there are just all kinds of problems with the Big Bang theory. And they don't have another one to fill in its place is the problem. The great dilemma of rejecting God as the designer of the universe is this. If God designed and made the universe, then everything operates according to his plan. If God did not make the universe, then there must be a naturalistic explanation. What does that mean? There's got to be something to explain it. If God didn't do it, then there's got to be a scientific reason for things to happen. But there is no known explanation for the spin. I did some research on this week. One of the things that scientists, particularly the astrophysicists, have found is that everything in the universe spins. All the planets, everything moves. The planets all spin, the sun spins, the earth spins, the planets spin around the sun, the sun itself is spinning around the galaxy itself is spinning, the whole universe is spinning. Where does spin come from? Why is everything spinning? Now, if you put everything in one pile and blew it up, would these things spin? No. So where did the spin come from? And what's really perplexing is we have either 8 or 9 planets, depending on whether you subscribe to kicking Pluto out of the planet. When we were kids, Pluto was a planet, but now they've decided it's not. But of all the planets around the sun, one of them spins backwards. Why would a planet spin the wrong way? If it's a product of a natural explosion, why would one of them spin differently than the others? There's no reason for it. Does anybody know which planet spins backwards? I had to look it up. Venus. Venus spins backwards. And you've got some other anomalies in the planets just looking at our small system. There's things that can't be explained by naturalistic explanation. Just doesn't work. And so science is at a real dilemma. They can't explain mathematically, physically, how this could be a naturalistic process. Now, if you accept that God did it, that's no problem. But it doesn't work otherwise. Also, the earth is tilted on its axis, 23 degrees. What effect does that have? Sir? Seasons. Yeah, for one thing, it causes seasons. Also, if the earth were not tilted, we couldn't live where we are. This part of the world would be uninhabitable. Only a very narrow part of the planet would be livable. But because it's tilted and it spins and it goes around the sun, it changes and it evens out the temperature. So it's astounding how many things have to work. If the earth were any closer to the sun, what would happen? It'd be too hot for us to live. If it went any further, we'd freeze. It's got to be in just a very narrow range for us to live. It's got to have that tilt. If it didn't have that tilt, the earth would, about 90% of it, be unlivable. And so God had to design this stuff. It didn't just happen, is the point. There's just too much going on for everything to work. What is DNA? Yeah, the building blocks of life. Watson and Crick, two of the most recognized mathematicians in the world. They won, ma'am? Nobel, thank you. They won Nobel Prize in mathematics. They did a study, a mathematical analysis of the DNA molecule. Now, these are two of the most recognized mathematicians on the planet. And their conclusion was that the DNA molecule is so complex, it could not have happened by accident. It's just flatly mathematically impossible for it to have occurred by accident. Where does that leave us? If it couldn't happen by accident, how did it happen? Somebody had to design it. One thing that's irritated me over the years is that universities and science in general just assumes that we're a product of evolution and chance and random action. And they would have us to believe that all intelligent people believe this, and if you don't believe this, that you're kind of ignorant and stupid. But I recently found that there is a large group, a very large group of scholars, academicians, doctorates in universities, PhDs in physics and math, who accept the concept of intelligent design. Now, they may not buy into God as we know him in the Bible, but they are forced to admit there's got to be intelligent design. There is a petition online that these people have signed, thousands of them. I looked it up. There are people from OU and OSU and major universities all over the country who have signed this thing that they believe in intelligent design. Of course, they're made fun of by some of their colleagues. So it's not this monolithic idea out there that all intelligent people believe in evolution. And if you believe in God, then obviously you're kind of ignorant. But that's not the case at all. There are thousands of scientists and very intelligent, well-educated people who say, obviously, there is an intelligent design to the universe. This could not have just happened by accident. Several years ago, the president of the Evolutionary Society of America got up and made a speech. He's a PhD from Harvard. He said, I must admit that there are a lot of questions about evolution that we simply don't have the answers to, that are just unexplainable. He says, but we must accept evolution. We must, because the alternative is unthinkable. What's the alternative? God did it. And he was honest enough to say, okay, either this universe is a product of evolution or an intelligent mind. I cannot accept that, so I am forced to accept evolution. Now I have here a cell phone. This thing is very smart. It's smarter than I am. I can't figure out how to use parts of it. But if I were to leave this here and somebody come along and look at it and say, I wonder how that got there. And if I were to say, oh, nobody put it there, it just happened, what would you say? There's not a soul on the planet that would think, well, that just happened. Why? Because it's designed. It's obviously demands a designer, as you said. And yet, compared to even Jeff's brain, how complicated is this? Jeff's brain is 1,000 times more complicated than this. And to say this had to have a designer, but Jeff's brain didn't. I mean, the universe is infinitely more complex than this thing, and yet nobody would say, well, that just happened by accident. We just took all these pieces and threw them in a box and shook it up and this popped out. No, nobody would believe that. The universe demands a designer. It's that complex. It's that complicated. But we're stuck with the Big Bang Theory, that the universe came about because of this gigantic explosion billions of years ago, and then everything came together and formed all the planets and the stars, and then life came out of the sea and turned into monkeys and dogs and giraffes. And it's nuts. To say that this is not a design is crazy. The universe is so complex. The laws governing the motions of the planets and the stars is just amazing. Our galaxy is composed of billions of stars spinning around the center. We have the sun and the various planets that were designed. It's just astounding how God has built all these things. And our time is up. Next week we will look at archaeology, some of the amazing discoveries that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Bible is indeed accurate and from God. Thank you for being with us today.